On behalf of the Culture Workers Support Trust, I invite you to this evening's panel discussion, Digital Fault Lines, Online Abuse, Resistance, and Creative Communities Today. We have with us Jyotsna Siddharth and Kaushal Sapre and Srujana Sridhar and Surya Mattu as panelists, and Radha Mahindru as the moderator for the session. But before we begin the panel discussion, let me just say a few words about the Culture Workers Support Trust. We are a registered charitable organization, and we work to generate interest and create awareness among culture workers about their rights and responsibilities. We help to create mechanisms and, to ensure that institutions will allow cultural workers to obtain effective and timely redressal of grievances that might arise as a function of their professional relationships. We advocate for the accountability and transparency in conduct and governance of institutions involved in the practice and pedagogy and research of arts and culture. CWST also takes up litigation and related to empowerment of culture workers. We also offer training and hold events to propagate causes that are of significance to professionals in the arts and culture field. And we strive to ensure that, the full human potential of culture workers can be realized. We work towards creating durable infrastructure that will foster a grounded and democratic cultural sphere. And so towards that, we've been organizing a number of different activities. Today's panel discussion is a continuation of those activities. And we have a Facebook page, and you can also write to us if you want more information about what we do. We have with us today, why is this not moving? Yeah, okay. Okay. So we have with us today Radha Mahindu. There's some problem with my PowerPoint. Sorry. I'm going to have to stop sharing. I'm sorry about this. There are always these technical glitches, but we have with us Radha Mahindru, who is, a creative practitioner, a curator, and a researcher, and who's interested in the intersection of work, of art practice and research. And she has worked towards creating platforms that lie outside of the exhibitory space. My PowerPoint has gone off, so I'll not be able to elaborate on what she does, but that's already there in the email invite. So welcome to this evening's panel discussion, and Radha will introduce the speakers, and the panel discussion will be for about 45 minutes. And so over to you, Radha.
Thank you, Shukla, and thank you, Culture Workers Trust, for bringing this panel together. I feel like this panel has many further potential for panels, and I hope maybe you guys can make this into a series because there's so much to share, discuss, and think through in this very, very vast area of the digital. Just a few house rules for today's session. We will begin, because we're a bit tight on time, we will begin with brief introductions into the practices of each of our panelists today, which will then be followed by a small Q&A session, and then we open it out to audience questions. The audience is welcome to put in their questions at any point of time in the chat function. And we'll try to take on as many of them as we can after 45 minutes. Thank you. To begin, we have Jyotsna Siddharth, artist and activist. Over to you, Jyotsna.
Thank you, Radha, and CWST for having me. I'll just begin with talking a little bit about my practice, and it's really something that I'm still kind of learning and developing, because I feel like this particular form of practice is a bit has been difficult for me to articulate in the beginning, because as an individual, when I began sort of getting into and exploring more with art, I was already building on my practice of an activist, and also somebody who is working and works in development. So it was difficult for me to call myself an artist. And it was also difficult because I'm a person who is interested in many things and forms and formats. And often I was told by friends and a lot of close people in my life that, like, you need to focus on one thing, and why do you you can't do everything, and if you focus on one particular thing, you might be able to perhaps create an impact. But I kind of realized that that failed me, and then kind of once I accepted and acknowledged that my practice really changed from there. So at the moment, I work to push boundaries of comfort and critical thinking. And rigor, nuances, compassion, and resilience are very, very important to me. And I keep trying to sort of hone that and build that in my practice. I'm deeply informed by the multitudinous of forms, material, and language of art making. So my practice really spread across the intersection of development, social art, activism, theater. And as a Dalit queer woman, my practice also is very much in the anti-caste space, but also in the feminist and queer spaces. I do believe that people have multiple vulnerabilities, which comes from their multiple identities, and the challenges that we have today in front of us require sort of complex and multidimensional practice to solve them, or maybe think of ideas. So I believe in making art which is sort of multidisciplinary, experimental, fluid, and I use text and body primarily. I work with embodied practice. I just would like to kind of share a little bit of my work, which might give you a sense of what I do. And if I could request Vidyun to share the links. Or I could also just go ahead and share them. Right. Right. So this was the recent work that I did when I was invited by Noneen. It's a magazine, which independent online monthly magazine, which is at the cusp of art, criticality, and love. And the person and the friend who started the magazine with her had invited me for a listening session, which was done in collaboration with Publics. And there I sort of spoke about constantly this feeling of living in exile and what that means. And as we sort of grow up in our lives, a lot of our relationships sort of either get lost, or there is this constant restlessness that we feel. So there was just this talk where I talked through about the idea of living in exile, not as a temporary, but as a constant sort of feeling. And then there was another work that I did with Isha. And this was part of the Internet Researchers Conference, which was organized in Sambhavna Institute. And we developed something called Tools for Care. So the idea was to bring care at the center of activism and the need to build care for activists, and to go beyond the very self-capitalistic idea of care, but to actually focus on creating community as well as individual care for activists, so that they're not burning out or dying prematurely, but are able to build resilience. And so we put together this physical toolkit, which was different objects that were researched and kind of put in a physical sort of toolkit, which gives you instructions to do different exercises or certain objects that one can use to really engage with self. Then there was another work that I did, which I was commissioned by DHRDNet and Public Policy, where they were doing a campaign on highlighting the incidents of caste-based violence. So I did a 3-minute video where it's called Call It What It Is, where this video used embodied practice, theater sort of techniques. This was shot in front of Parliament. And the idea was to bring out the rage and the sadness of the ongoing caste-based violence, and sort of calling it not just a rape or murder, but calling it what it is, which is caste-based violence. I'm just quickly rushing through because I don't want to take a lot of time. There was another work that Vidisha and I did, which was through a collective that we formed in 2017, which is called CIVE. And this work is called Walking Upon Bodies. We created an album of different aspects that we were sort of grappling with in the last year and last year, and with the COVID and a lot of ongoing protests that were happening. We created an album where the order is sort of, usually the order in podcast is very linear, that there is a recording and people are talking and you just listen. But we created these different kind of tracks where there is no order. So you pick two albums, any two albums of your choice, and the idea is to listen to them either together or however one desire. And that brings out different conversations, aspects that otherwise goes missing in a linear podcast. And then the last work, which is an ongoing work, it's called Janeu Prompts. And this is, again, a response to the ongoing sexual violence and the caste-based violence against minorities, where the object that I play with is Janeu. And as a Dalit queer woman, also coming from my identity, but also largely in society, Janeu is something that is considered to be so sacrosanct and pure that it's only worn by upper caste Hindu men. So using the object of Janeu and playing with it in a theatrical way, and responding to different cases of caste-based violence was my way to create dissent and to sort of highlight that there is an ongoing systemic violence against minorities for decades, and it continues to be. And just I created like a database where we were recording cases from 2000 up till now, different cases that have occurred in India, and just picking those incidents and sort of playing with Janeu as a response to, because I mean, there are times that you feel helpless and you don't know what to do, and words are not enough. So in a more metaphorical way and in a more symbolic way, this project is an ongoing project which is trying to create dissent and vocabulary of dissent by a marginalized body, queer body, to respond to the cases of caste-based and sexual violence. And I'll stop here. Thank you for listening very patiently.
Thank you, Jyotsna. I think Vidyun will also be sharing the links to these works in the chat at the end of the session. We have Kaushal now. Kaushal Sapre.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kaushal. Thank you for inviting me. I'd just like to situate my practice in terms of the larger conversation that we have. I'll just share my screen. Is it visible?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm not very vocal on social media, um, but I mean I was reading the abstract that was being shared earlier, and I was thinking that I identify more with the lurker figure than anything else. Also, just a note, Radha, just stop me whenever, or just let me know whenever I'm going overboard with time. Uh, so yeah.
Sure.
I started kind of thinking about the internet seriously in 2019. In August 2019, the revocation of Section 370 in Kashmir happened, and immediately after that, there was the internet shutdown in Kashmir. And that particular internet shutdown, I mean, it was hardly the first internet shutdown that was happening in Kashmir or in India. But that particular shutdown was also quite a mediatized event in the sense. I mean, newspapers were kind of counting the days of the shutdown, right? 40 days, 41 days, so on and so forth. Um, and it was quite an interesting thing to think through for me, because what it was opening was that there was some implication between the internet and the geography, and that was something that I thought was uh, revealed something about the internet that was quite antithetical as compared to how platforms imagine the internet for us, or platforms kind of imagine the internet for the user. And that imagination is much more globular, much more smoother, especially if you are in kind of an urban center like Delhi. Then you're never supposed to be too far away from a Zomato order kind of a situation, right? uh, in that context was when I kind of started looking seriously at the internet infrastructure. And I've been working with a group of artists, many of whom are there in this group called Out of Line, and we'd been kind of having conversations around this incident, but also in general around infrastructures of communication, infrastructures of telecommunication. And I'd just like to quickly share three works or three projects that have emerged out of some of these conversations as a way to think about uh, how or how can we think about the internet as such, and the politics of the internet as such. Um, so this is uh, uh, the first project that I'd like to share is called Home for a While, and it was actually it was displayed in a in IIC in Delhi, in a very kind of a sanitized white cube space, um, uh, where Out of Line was invited to participate in an exhibition. And what Home for a While is a it's a Wi-Fi network. It's a local area Wi-Fi network, which means that you can only access it when you are within the exhibition space. And it's basically like the exhibition space essentially look like this. This is kind of the schematic of the exhibition space. I'll also rather, if you can, or someone can kind of share these links, so that just in case of posterity. But this is how it looked. This was basically just a router in the exhibition space in the gallery, and I found that image quite interesting of having uh, a router within a gallery. But what this router also did was broadcast a Wi-Fi network which you could connect to, and the process of connecting it was quite a uh, I mean, it was quite a process, I guess. So you had to find a Wi-Fi network called Home for a While. You have to put in a password. You have to switch off your mobile data, which was the only way that you could access this network. And then you have to type in the IP address of the network in Google Chrome, and that's how you ended up accessing or becoming a part of Home for a While. And what Home for a While then served was a bunch of files. It was basically just a bare file server, which had a bunch of research material that was compiled by Out of Line around things that were happening at that time, but also in terms of ideas around disconnection. So there were some readings, there were some how-to manuals, how to kind of jam uh, a mobile network, or how to create captive portals. There were a few readings. There were also a couple of, at that time I was kind of trying to develop some or learning how to develop Android apps. So there were a couple of like really stupid Android apps that were there on this network. There were some writings, but in I mean. What was interesting for me in this process was that I would be there in the gallery and I would try to just trying to talk to people to get to connect to the network was something quite interesting. There was some kind of a suspicion that sometimes I would read, which was quite, understandable when someone is asking you to kind of shut down your mobile data and join this network. There was some paranoia around data that emerged. But the interesting part in all this was that this exhibition opened in December 2019, and a week after this exhibition opened, or within a week or so, the protests in Delhi started, and internet shutdowns in Delhi started. And it was quite natural then to think of try to get this network outside to make it portable. And essentially that's how the second project that I'd like to share, which is Inqilab Network, is how Inqilab Network developed. Yeah. Okay. So in that sense, one thing that I found quite interesting was that the gallery space kind of ended up becoming like a dry run, which in kind of looking back, seems like a productive way of looking at a white cube. But Inqilab Network was essentially a portable Wi-Fi network that you could carry around in a backpack to protest spaces, and it hosted a bunch of material, including texts, memes, the amendment acts themselves, readings, and just other shareable material that anyone could download and then kind of circulate further. So I mean, what was interesting for me also was that once Inqilab Network started going outside and started traveling in different protest spaces, there were certain technical kind of problems that needed to be resolved. For example, the router needed to be eliminated for it to become portable. So what we ended up doing was that the development of the network as such kind of happened in parallel as the protests themselves were also developing. So every week there would be some kind of change, either a design intervention or an intervention within how one could connect to the network. That were kind of ways of evolving how Inqilab Network was imagined, that was happening. So soon enough we had kind of some interventions within the interface, the design, and all this was being done by a group of friends who were kind of either designing or kind of working on the back end, or working on in the protests, putting up posters, things like that. So yeah, I won't go into too much of the technicality, but yeah, one interesting thing that happened eventually was that Inqilab Network got installed at the Hosrani protest, and where then it started kind of finding some space to grow. So eventually we there was a request to try and put something like a chat room within Inqilab Network, so that got it incorporated. So I'm just going to take you around like some of the screenshots of how it looked like. There was kind of an editorial essay of sorts of सरकार को इंटरनेट से डर क्यों लगता है. There were also books. There was a gallery of memes, of images, and this Hosrani Live was the chat room that was operated within the space. But eventually, as we all know, kind of the protests, the lockdown happened in March 2020, and the protests were dismantled, and Inqilab Network, the hardware and the infrastructure, kind of went away with that. But as you can see, by the time it kind of developed, it became a very different engagement or interaction with joining and participating within the network. These are some of the posters that were made by friends that were being kind of circulated around spaces. So I mean, as an experience of working on this, I feel like what was emerging was just a figure of a user. And again, I'm trying to draw parallels in terms of a certain imagination of users that platforms produce. I think this has been a running conversation in the classes that I facilitate in Ambedkar University, where we're kind of really trying to deconstruct what this user figure means when platforms design interfaces. Um, so in that sense, it was quite interesting to think through this, because the user figure was never abstract, or there seemed to be some violence that was being perpetuated, even though a platform comes with some kind of a benevolent position. But once this network kind of the operation stopped in March 2020, I'd like to then share like quickly share a third project that has been kind of ongoing for the past nearly a year, which I've been working on with my colleague Asma, who's also there in the, in the group. And this is called This Might Not Be Online. And This Might Not Be Online is basically a server that is right here next to me. Sorry about the train sounds. There's a train right next to me. But This Might Not Be Online is basically a home server. It's a bunch of computers that are online all the time, and that are sharing data to that are accessible on the internet, but that are being managed and maintained by us at home. And all the files, for example, that were being shared, and all the material that was being shared in home for a while, as well as with Intelab network, are being hosted over here. So something like the Incolab network content was something like this, where we had a bunch of texts, we had some posters, um, other stuff in general. But then there is also the other thing right now that This Might Not Be Online also hosts is the ability to make notes or to make kind of collaborative documents. So we've been kind of using this infrastructure to keep making lists, and somehow I think I've kind of been interested in lists these days. So for example, this is a list of PhD programs that friends are kind of building together, just in terms of prospective PhD programs, in case somebody is interested to go through them, or this is a list of tools to help with writing. So it's a bunch of, again, just a list of tools. But it also seems to be functioning as a some kind of a publication platform of sorts. For example, this is a note that Asma had written when she was in Beirut in 2019-20 as a fellow in Ashkal Alwan. So essentially, she ended up witnessing firsthand the protests that were happening in Lebanon, and there's kind of a reflective note that she was working on, and which is kind of published through This Might Not Be Online. The interesting part about This Might Not Be Online is that it's uh, for example, it was down twice today because there were power cuts. So in that sense, it's extremely fragile, and it seems to be kind of changing nearly every week. Something keeps changing, something keeps breaking down, and in that sense, the practice seems to be a constant kind of maintenance of infrastructure, which is something I think which is something that shows like the other side of the platform, or how the platform itself as a machine or as a piece of machinery is kind of functioning. But just to kind of end on a couple of observations that I wanted to make was, one thing that I feel like I realized in this process was that the internet shutdowns are just the most visible symptom of a certain systemic inequality that is embedded within the infrastructure itself. It's only the internet shutdowns that kind of, because they are so incidental and because they kind of make a mark as such within the media landscape, they appear. But in reality, there are multiple kind of, or rather the whole infrastructure is the terrain is never flat, the way platforms try to imagine, but it's always kind of hierarchical and kind of segmented and fragmented. And I think that's something very important in terms of a certain awareness that at least I found in working through this side of things. And I feel like this systemic inequality also appears especially in the figure of the user, because platforms often imagine the user as someone with capital, with good internet first of all, but also in general with both symbolic capital and in terms of a sense of speakability, I feel. But what they also end up doing is that as a, like to sort of prop up the figure of the user or the subjectivity of the user, there appear other subjectivities that get invisibilized within the platform logic. So something like a content moderator when it comes to social media platforms, or something like a partner when it comes to something like delivery apps, so these subjectivities are the ones where this the inequality gets kind of activated the most, and that's where I feel the terrain of the internet starts or the terrain of the platform starts kind of playing out this violence. And I feel like approaching the internet with this awareness could be one kind of generative way to try and think about context of the culture or community as a whole. So I'll just stop here, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaushal. I think Shrujana, did you?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just 1 second. Hi, so thank you so much for inviting me. Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri, and happy Onam to everyone. I'm Shrujana. I'm an artist and illustrator from Mumbai, and I started out with writing storybooks. I think if you could just open the first few images, which have all the storybook illustrations. Okay. Okay, so I started out with writing and illustrating storybooks, which is still the most precious thing for me, and I will continue that throughout my practice. I also work on editorial illustrations. I run the Dalit Panther archive, and I'm currently working with a couple of friends. This researcher called Sanjana Ajit, an artist, Ajinkya Dekhne, and Ritik London on a very exciting new collective called Mavili Nadu Collective, which is still a work in progress and it's coming soon. So we're really excited. And for me, in terms of my work, has really been a journey in terms of like coming to terms with my identity and not hiding from it. And if I had known that embracing my identity as a Dalit woman if I had embraced that identity, it would have taken away loneliness and helped me find a community. If I knew all this, I would have done it a long time ago. And basically in 2016, I was working on the Dalit archive with some of my friends. And uh, I was learning a lot, and it felt like I was lacking something in terms of the work is not visible. So when I started working on the Dalit Panther archive, which was basically documenting little magazines and just any text from the Dalit Panther movement, written, whether it was published within the magazine movement or outside of it, we were digitizing it and putting it online. And even while we were in the process of doing that and interviewing members from the movement, there was just something that I would, back in 2016, where I would keep feeling like I couldn't connect myself completely. And it And it was so weird for me because I seem to have forgotten that growing up, my father had surrounded me with the legacy of the Panthers and their poetry from the very beginning. And I don't know how I had forgotten all those nights of sitting up and translating Namdev Hasal's poetry with him, or I just didn't want to make that connection. But back then, I was all about not involving my personal self or story in my practice or projects back then. And I was very weirdly proud of this notion, which was like, looking back, it makes zero sense for an artist at my vantage point to do, in any case, then I think I truly felt like I got a sense of placing myself in a community and owning up to my work when I started working on some editorial illustrations for First Post for an 18-part series on saffronization of coastal Karnataka, written by my friend and journalist Krishma Kuttar. And just to give you some context, my parents have an intercaste marriage. My mother is a Tuluva woman and my father is from a Buddhist family. So it felt so empowering to work with someone who was pushing me to celebrate us. And I don't know if she knew what she was doing, but that's just how it happened. When I used to work on these like 18 illustrations for her, she would just make sure it doesn't elitist, even casteist, my work would have ever found space, And over the years, I have tried to use online platforms for many things. I've used it as a digital archive space for citizen journalism, or just a place to upload my work or to find a sense of community and safe space. And at the end of the day, I really don't know if online activism is sustainable or if it does manage to support and help on ground activists in any, quote unquote, real ways. But I do know that if those with any sort of power exist on online and on social media platforms to abuse those from marginalized identities, then we have to be there to represent ourselves and subvert those conversations and question them or even shut them down completely. um, I'm part of a citizen journalism platform called Public Bolti, and we worked with Dalit Human Rights Defenders Network in 2020, like Jyotsna had mentioned in their presentation. Uh, it was a social media campaign called No Lockdown on Caste Atrocities, and it was a campaign to launch a report on the increase of caste atrocities during the pandemic brought on by COVID-19. And the cases documented in the report were so gruesome and cruel that we had decided from the very beginning that we didn't want that mainstream oppressor caste gaze that is used for showing these atrocities. And we brought together 30 artists from different practices like Jyotsna, and we wanted to have the cases represented by artists from DBA communities, because only artists from the community can represent themselves in these conversations with dignity. And these cases were completely ignored by mainstream media, or even if they did cover them, they used a very exploitative gaze. So, well, of course, social media is like an extremely unsafe and toxic space, and like any other space in society is. I don't think it's exclusive only to social media. I think we need to protect the safe spaces we've managed to create within them, because it really has opened up the whole world to people like us who otherwise would have been forgotten, and only some very woke young liberal elite kid from an oppressor caste would write about this quaint art movement in their master's thesis like 30 years from now. So yeah, that's pretty much my work. I'm sorry if I took up too much time.
Thanks, Rujana. No, you were well within your time. Um, thank you. But we are running a bit late. Surya?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be fast and share my screen. Um, can I share my screen?
Vidyan, I think you need to end screen sharing.
Oh, I think I'll be able to do it. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, wrong screen. Excuse me. All right. So if you can't see what I'm sharing, you should see a hand waving. If you don't see that, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just try to power through this. So hi, everyone. My name is Surya Mattu. I'm an artist, engineer, and accidental journalist. I'm based in Brooklyn, but I grew up in Delhi. And I just want to walk through a couple of projects that I've done and how I kind of got into where I do the kind of work I do now. So my main day job these days is I work as an investigative data journalist, which we're still trying to figure out what that means. But I work at a place called The Markup, which is a nonprofit newsroom based out of New York City. And we basically, our main focus is looking at the tech industry, and like we have a pretty broad take on what we mean by tech, like everything from like social media platforms, network infrastructure companies, as well as kind of these new data-driven ecosystems that are actually perpetuating an old form of like systemic oppression. So like, things like algorithmic systems that are being used for hiring software or for education apps. We look for the ways in which these, in the ways companies basically try to hide behind technology and still kind of perpetuate some form of discrimination. And often what we're finding is that discrimination isn't like, historically, like there was like often a person who had that intent, and the way it works now is because the tech often is built with the values of the culture it's created in, that discrimination is so deeply embedded that often it's hard to hold someone accountable because people just come back and say, oh, we didn't know this was happening, we're really sorry. So a big part of our job is trying to figure out how to shine a light on the ways in which these discriminations happen to make it common sense that they would happen if they're not taken into account from the start. And that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about and try to report on. So that's the Markup, and you should check it out if you're interested in that space. But I'll just quickly talk about a couple of my own projects and how I kind of got here. So I have a background in engineering, in electronic engineering, and I was always interested. And when I worked as an electronic engineer, I actually worked for a company that was in like the healthcare space. We made these microchips that went into sensors for heart rate monitoring in hospitals. And what was really interesting for me about that experience in hindsight was when I worked as an engineer, that kind of engineering job, the ecosystem was fully aware of the fact that when you introduce a new piece of technology into an environment, you will solve certain problems, but you'll also introduce new ones. So it's really important that whenever, like, even if it's something as simple as a heart rate monitor, which is a very old kind of technology in the grand scheme of things, even when we were trying to introduce that, there was so much rigor behind the testing and the documentation and like the testing of it in the environment that I always took it for granted that like when new things are introduced into an environment, like they always kind of have that kind of testing and rigor that they go through. But what I learned through these kind of distributed platforms and large scale networks that we have on things like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, basically things that like the internet on scale has enabled, these data-driven systems that we now are all kind of entangled with. That same rigor does not exist. Like people build things, they put them out there, they're seen by a million people, and often like there's no one to hold to account when something goes wrong. And this is it. I don't think it started by design, but because that was kind of the default setting when we started, a lot of companies and political organizations and agencies are trying to harness that to their advantage by saying, hey, again, it's not our fault. people are doing the sharing, people on the platform are using it in a way we didn't intend, we can't really do anything about it. So I spend a lot of time thinking about these kinds of things, and a big focus of the work I do and the ways in which I do it is trying to get to a place where when we talk about technology, the role technology plays in our life, we talk about it from a place of agency, not apathy for the person. So like this is something that comes up a lot at the markup where I work, where it's something that it can be a real bummer, when you read about tech, like there's so much bullshit and fucked up shit in the world that you're like, oh, and this is now one new thing I have to worry about that you feel like you have no agency over. So what I often try to do in the work I'm creating is try to make sure that I build it in a way that like gives the person who's experiencing it some sort of sense of agency over the role technology is playing in their life, not just a sense of apathy that they can't do anything about it. So I want to share, like, basically, I think I'll share two projects in the interest of time, and these are not related to the market; these are older works, but they were kind of influential in my kind of journey. So this is from 2014. It's a project called From the Dark. Back in 2014, I was just finishing up grad school in New York, and it was just after the Snowden leaks here. And up till that point, there was a lot of conversation about the hypothetical ability of surveillance to happen by the NSA and big tech and all of this. But there wasn't really a lot of documented evidence. So when Snowden's leaks happened and we had that evidence, it really changed the conversation around what it means for dragnet surveillance to be taking place. And around that time, the surveillance economy was also really beginning to prop up in New York and kind of in the world in general. But one specific aspect that I was interested in back then was there were these companies that were popping up that were basically providing in-store targeted advertising the way they claimed you would get it on a browser. So basically their claim was that, hey, like Gap, Whole Foods, whatever, normal kind of brick and mortar stores, if you install our hardware routers in your stores, you will be able to track people coming through your stores with the same level of precision that you would as if they came to your website. So you'd know when people come back, where they hang out in the store, and you'd be able to like redesign your store because of that. And and they had this little note, all these companies, this little note at the bottom that was like, oh, obviously we care about privacy, blah, 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 but we don't, all the data we collect is totally anonymous and could not be used to identify anyone. So I like, that's obviously not true. You can't be doing that level of invasive tracking and then not have it be personally identifiable. So I started digging into how it works and like what protocols they relied on to do this. And essentially they relied on a very specific feature of Wi-Fi, which I'm sure all of you have experienced at some point in your life, which is the fact that when your Wi-Fi network is on your phone, but you aren't connected to a network, your phone automatically tries to connect to any of the networks it's connected to in the past. So back in 2014, so I mean, this makes sense, right? It's like people want to save money on their data plan. They don't want to be using the cellular data when they can. So the software was designed to make sure that whenever possible, switch to Wi-Fi if you can. And so in 2014, how that protocol used to work was that your phone would basically broadcast every network it had ever connected to and just be like, hey, are you here? Can I connect to you? So this was basically the signal that these companies were relying on. And when you think about it, like when Wi-Fi was first kind of created in the early 2000s, there was nothing that like personally identifiable about Wi-Fi networks. But if you think about like 10 years later and how ubiquitous Wi-Fi is now, Wi-Fi network names are incredibly personal thing. Like, people like put their own personality into their network names. And like you start thinking about every network you've ever connected to, that really builds like a history of all the places you've been to and connected to Wi-Fi. And your phone was essentially just like shouting all those places out. So mine would be like JFK Airport, NYU, India Art Fair, whatever. Like all these networks are just being completely spat out, unencrypted into the ether, and any device that was listening for those packets would be able to pick it up. So I thought this was really interesting and wanted to find a way to engage people in this conversation and make them better understand what was happening. So what I started doing was I built a little piece of software that would like listen to these packets too, and then collate all the networks associated with one device. And I started building these portraits for people. So like I was doing this when I was in grad school, so it was actually a pretty nice serendipitous moment because I actually knew a lot of these people. And when I would see a list of networks like this, I could usually guess who the person was, because the conferences you go to, the hotels you stay at, the things you've done in your life, all of these are now like kind of embedded in our digital identities, even in ways which you don't expect. I really like this particular network this network portrait because the person it belonged to, when I showed it to them, they really had like a real physical gasp when they saw it, and it was because of this fifth network here called Umpalai Umpato. So this person's from Uruguay, and she said, it's so weird to see that network here. That's the first sound my nephew ever made when he was born, and my sister and her husband thought it was a funny sound, so they named it their Wi-Fi network. And I was like, right, so like your phone is actually broadcasting Umpalai Umpato everywhere you go. And if anyone's listening, they're actually picking that up. And what was really cool for me about this project was I was able to talk to people about a kind of weird technical network protocol, but contextualize it into something that was about them and about their life. And I could also give them something to do about it. I said, if you don't want this to happen, all you have to do is turn off Wi-Fi on your phone when you're not using it, and they won't be able to collect this data. And I found that that cycle actually led to quite a productive feedback loop of getting people to change their behavior and having some room to do something. And since then, that's kind of the path I try to follow. So I work in art, education, and journalism. Already gone for 10 minutes. I'm not going to share more projects, but the thing that I basically try to constantly emphasize through my work is I think best represented by this GIF, which is that humans drive technology, and often we put a lot of responsibility on the ways in which technology influences our life on the tech. And a lot of my focus is trying to find ways to put it back on the people who make that tech. And with that, I will stop.
Thanks, Surya. Can I request our other panelists also to join in with their videos? Also to encourage everyone who's in the audience to keep sending us questions. Otherwise, I'll keep asking them questions and hounding them. Actually, I was thinking about this when within and I started speaking about this panel also, that for me personally, December 2019 was a very defining moment in thinking about how enmeshed our real life world with our online world is. And I think Kaushal's already spoken about this a little bit, but I think from localized internet shutdowns to the fact that there was so much of organizing and collectivizing that was happening through these platforms, there was a lot of censorship that was happening. It was the first time, I think, at least I had experienced where specific posts shared on Instagram were being taken down. Specific words were prompting entire accounts to suddenly vanish. And at the same time, because of the lack of reporting in social media, it was our only place to get to know what is happening somewhere. And it was also a reporting platform. And to complicate it further, you also had the surveillance of people participating in the protests and filming of these people. And I think it was a time, and I think since then, actually, whether then it was the riots or the migrant crisis or the COVID relief after that, that it's just kind of like compounded, and it's also led to new kinds of behaviors. So I guess my first question, Surya, for you, since everything we just spoke just now, is that how do we imagine, I think increasingly our sense of the internet is that what the platforms provide us, and that at best you have to negotiate these and fight for the rights as framed by the state. So one is that how do we think, or what is, let's say, a reorientation that we should do when we're thinking of user, platform, state? That's one question. And the second is that how do we then think of the role of the big tech itself when thinking about free speech and expression?
Cool. So let me see, not very easy questions to answer. I have very simple, succinct answers to both of those. I think, in my opinion, a big so the relationship to government is really complicated because it really depends on every place. Every country has like a different, like, history, a different kind of dynamic of how technology is being used there. And these companies are basically kind of doing like a the path of least friction for them and how to make everyone happy. And essentially it comes down to whoever bugs them is the one that they like, they'll just like they'll try to appease them. So in the US, for example, like Apple will have these strong kind of strong take on privacy and end-to-end encryption and not letting like the FBI like look into someone's data. But in China, they'll just not tell anyone and change the rules because they know in China they have to operate, it has to kind of operate in that way. So I think like if I had to dream and wish to have whatever I could, the way we would get to something different is actually to just to not center them in the conversation. So the kinds of projects that Kaushal was sharing, like, these ideas of like the cool thing about the internet is it really can be decentralized. But the thing that I think we haven't quite figured out yet is how do you scale decentralization and what does scaling decentralization actually even mean? And for me, what it really comes down to is three really simple things. It comes down to, at this stage of where we are with the role of tech, it comes down to literacy, regulation, and competition. So I think we need more literacy about what technology, what is enabled by like the underlying tech and what is enabled by the tech companies. So for example, when we talk about companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google being these multi-billion-dollar companies, we never really talk about the fact that they actually sit on a resource that was built by the US military for a completely different purpose and then could just harness that and make billions of dollars. So we kind of think that like they are the internet, but actually the internet, the underlying things that enable the internet are much older than them. So there's like a relationship here to like the context I always try to give it to people who like in this privacy conversation talk about having nothing to hide, where they're like, I don't care, these companies take my data because I have nothing to hide. I think that's the wrong framing often because that framing makes it sound like it's an issue of civil liberties, where these companies like want to know who you are, but they don't actually give a shit who you are. What they just want to do is be able to make money off you. So it's actually far more extractive the way like colonialism used to be, which is you take resources from one place for the benefit of another and then reorganize how that place works for your benefit. And I think that's what's happening in tech, and that's what I would like to see change. But to do that from where we sit now, in my opinion, those are the three things you need: more education, more literacy, more regulation, and that hopefully will then lead to competition for how products can work differently.
Okay, I have many follow-up questions, but I'm going to first go to Kaushal, because I mean, I was thinking about this also, that I mean, I think, I guess there's a bit of a flux, right? Because I feel like a lot of conversation around digital platforming is obsessed with the technology of it. The way we talk about technology, I mean, all these applications is not from a non-tech perspective. And then you're made to feel that, oh, this is complicated stuff, this is inaccessible, leave it for the experts. And experts are not policy makers or like anthropologists or, people who are philosophers. The experts are the coders. And so I think what was interesting for me, Kaushal, about your practice is that it's asking philosophical questions, perhaps, or broader questions, but it's also like actually engaging with that, with the technology itself. And I guess my question or what I'd like you to reflect or share with us is that how does that work? Is it, can everyone build a server? I mean, how do you arrive at this practice?
No, it's can anyone build a server? Yeah, anyway. So it's like this. I feel like it's a and I think there's a general consensus about this, that the internet, the way it looked like say 20 years ago, is very different than the way it looks like now, and that's a lot to do with platforms and platform monopolies. And I think something that Surya also brought up a little bit earlier is very interesting, which is that internet changes from wherever you go or wherever you are. In China, the internet looks completely different. The landscape of platforms also looks completely different, and the kind of the tussle that the platforms go through with state are also completely different. In India, again, there's and within India also in different geographies. In that sense, I feel like, for example, the question of scaling came up, and I feel like a lot to do comes down to the question of scaling, because when you're hosting like a home server that 10-20 of your friends are kind of going to access, where you're not really looking at them as users, you're looking at them as friends, and tomorrow they have a certain kind of understanding that tomorrow there might be a power cut and the server might go down, and it's all okay. And then if something like that happens, and if someone's data is if someone needs to access the data, then it's a much more kind of an interpersonal affair where you're talking to each other and finding other ways to figure things out together. But as soon as we get this mindset of scale into the equation, then the figure of the user gets abstracted. Then it becomes more about numbers. And it's an interesting question for me to think about: when does a group of people start becoming numbers? No? I feel like it's a lot to do with this dynamic between a company trying to, or a startup trying to produce a platform to solve a social problem, or a sort of a problem that they identify in society through technical means, because more often than not, it's never the technical means that give you a solution to problems. In fact, what they do is that they produce other problems or more problems in the sense. So the relationship between users and platforms in that sense is kind of always contingent with this, and especially with scale, because they end up boxing you in within this thing. And like I said, then the other subjectivities that actually support or supplement this whole structure are what get invisibilized. And mainly it's also this, right, that every tech company is coming with a benevolent motive. They're not coming in to kind of they don't imagine themselves as kind of evil people, right? So there's something that, say, Mark Zuckerberg says, like, we are a tech company, we are not a publisher. And the distinct, or the difference between a tech company and a publisher is, I feel, very important, because in claiming to be a tech company, what they are doing is they are saying that we are apolitical. But in doing that itself, I feel like I mean, for them, it's a good thing to have a political debate within the platform, because that means more data to be extracted. But in many ways, then I mean, yeah, I mean, I feel like scale has a lot to do with this, and I feel like uh, tactical approaches could be a way to deal with this in some sense. And I mean, like, for example, building a server and things like that are stuff that I feel like my friends and I are kind of working on these things and learning as we go. But one realization that I feel I've had is that tactical approaches already exist. They exist wherever internet kind of becomes something that incites violence, or it produces systemic violence. Like, for example, there's one example that I tend to think through this, which is that say something like Uber drivers in Delhi have a completely different sense of the geography of Delhi, precisely because so something like they'll know speed cameras, or where speed cameras are planted within the streets of Delhi, or within the geography of Delhi, without even having to refer to a map as such. And so there is a practice that is already kind of ingrained, which is learned and ingrained, where they know when to slow down and when to speed up. And I feel that is a very tactical approach, or a very tactical response to a certain surveillance mechanism. And so these approaches are already there around us, but because of a certain kind of clamping down of the user figure, we don't generally end up noticing them or understanding them. And I feel like that is also something to do with privilege. So I feel like that needs to be deconstructed in some sense to think through this productively.
Thanks. I will. Okay. Okay, we will take questions in a bit. Jyotsna, a question for you. Actually, it's a question for everybody, and I'm not even sure if it's a question or not. But just in the morning, I was reading the markup, and it was talking about doxing. So apparently, I didn't know this term, but doxing, it seems, is when you, out of revenge or anger, put out personal, sensitive information about people onto public and social media platforms. I think when the internet shutdown happened, for the duration it happened in Kashmir, it was inconceivable that it could go on for that long. When localized internet shutdowns happened in Delhi, it was shocking to see that ye idhar bhi ho sakta hai. So there is this, I feel like the state / tech also kind of recalibrates and comes up with new ways of instigating violence. I mean, I don't know what other word we can use, but violence. And we're still, I mean, and new techniques are kind of thought of and deployed on a daily basis. It was inconceivable maybe 5 years ago to think of troll farms being organized the way they are around people. So I guess my question to you, Jyotsna, is that, I mean, as a Dalit queer activist who's been doing so much of work with development and organizations and in the grassroots, I think that there is also this, how do we inform our digital or internet activism by on-ground activism and by experience that that activists like yourself have had for years? Because it's not like, while the tools and the language may be new, it is all kind of furthering and built upon on systemic violence that exists in the offline world. And I think you've also spoken about this a little bit earlier, but I mean, I would love to hear more from you on this.
Right. I think for me, online and offline is really not different, right? Like, I think that our repercussions of working on the ground is obviously manifested online and vice versa. So for me, these are different spaces, but very much connected to each other. And I think activism has also gone through a lot of change, right? I mean, today we see a lot of newer people, newer generation who's, I mean, younger than me, who are claiming the activist space. And that's great. I feel like more and more new and young people need to come into the space. But I think there is a divide and disconnect with the history of assertions and activism as we understand. A lot of people, I feel, are learning things and history that have happened ages ago now, of course, and I don't think that's to do with their age, really. I think it's just about activism. I mean, now it's become more that sort of a space where there are different forms and ways of asserting it are emerging, and I think that's great. But there was a time where activism really meant being on the ground, really sacrificing yourself, your personal interests, or your personal lives, and to being committed to a particular cause, right? And I think that today, because we have access to internet and we have access to social media, now that space has also become a space where you're able to assert. And for communities who've not had access to mainstream media, or you know, the journalist spaces that never really sort of gave spaces to different kind of marginalized identities, I think a lot of people are using social media today to kind of say that, you know, we don't really need a mainstream channel now to tell our stories. We very much have our own platforms to share. But I think in all of that process, I think what really I feel goes missing is the understanding that we're not inventing the wheel for the first time, right? Like, there's so much work that has already been done, and if there's work done for decades by people whose legacy we're actually standing on and able to articulate and work and further our work. So I think that is something that goes missing in the online space, where we feel that there is a lot of opinion, there is a lot of anecdotes, and there is a lot of things, but it's hard to know the evidence or the factual sort of knowledge that goes with it. And of course, I mean, I think anecdotes and personal narratives are as important, but I find then the space slightly confusing, because I'm unable to sometimes make decisions or my own sort of opinion about issues, because there is so much and there is a lot of sort of quantity, but I don't know whether or not that is all true. And I think that, I don't know if I'm able to answer your questions, but I think as we, and I keep saying that, you know, as we look at developing and honing any skill, I think activism has to be seen like that. It's not something that you just do it today because you feel like, and then you ready to champion a space. I think it requires many, many years of endurance, learning, falling, failing, and then getting up, and then understanding. And that constant process of learning and unlearning has to be on, both for yourself and for others. And with others, I mean the issues in society. So I think a lot of that nuance gets sidelined or missed out in the online activism space, I feel.
Do you think it's also maybe producing a new kind of imagination of what a political person is or what an activist is? Because sometimes I feel maybe the fact that the attention spans are reducing. I mean, now we don't even want to watch IGTV, we want to watch reels.
Right.
That this bite-sizedness of things is making things less complex and flattening people, like the information that's being put out. And how does one like work in an intersectional way, given that the fact is that these platforms are viral, these platforms are, are there strategies that you are employing actively, or from your experience, you've like decided that you are not going to go in this way on a platform? That's one. And related to that, the reason I was talking about this producing of this new political imagination, or what political is also like this question of cancel culture, which is the other point of how people seem to be, active. Thoughts on this?
I think there are a lot of questions here, and I definitely do have an opinion on all of them. But I think, yes, there is a certain kind of newer imagination of what political person can be or is, and I think that's great. But I do feel that I don't think we are there yet. I think before that there is more. There is a lot of political performance that I see. So if there was more if there was a process of becoming more political, that would be more welcomed. But of course, I mean, these boundaries are so blurred. It's not that, okay, now being a political person or performing politics is also different. There is a very thin line, and we are constantly navigating through those lines. But I do see a lot of political performance happening on social media. And I feel that because I think for me, social media is a platform, is a way to amplify my work and work of other people, who the work that I find meaningful and the work that enriches me. It's not about gaining followers, right? And I think there is a lot of focus on how many followers you have, and then your opinions become more important because you have 10K followers or whatever. So for me, I think the idea is not to work in that manner. For me, social media platform is to be used to showcase the actual work that I'm doing. And I'm not saying that, of course, people are not working on social media, right? A lot of people are using that platform to work. And but I find it difficult to only use a platform to work. I think for me, the real work happens on the grassroots, on the ground, even if it's not grassroots, but whatever your sense of community is, and using internet and social media to amplify and showcase that. I think for me that is important, and the work is really sort of driven in a way that you take responsibility for what you're putting out there, and you're accountable for it, whether it's right or wrong. It's not something that you just put out and you forget. So I think accountability is something which is extremely really important and must be important. And I don't know, I mean, cancel culture, you know, Radha, I mean, this cancel culture is again something which is amplified a lot through social media, because it's easier to put out of context narratives in the public domain, and I would kind of leave that on a discretion of an individual, as I keep saying, to decide whether or not they find value or whatever they desire in a particular outcome. That's for them to decide. But I do feel that it has made cancel culture very easy, and just to kind of conclude there. Yeah.
Shrujana, it was really nice to hear about the clarity that you have in the way you recognize how social media is, and therefore how you would like to use it to further your practice. And I think it's also interesting because I feel maybe it also lends itself more easily to certain creative practices. Sorry, you were going to say
Yeah, I was just saying.
so I was wondering if you have strategies or some insights on how you engage with it, and also this thing that you said of creating or maintaining safe spaces, and this sense of community that you found. Any strategies and insights you can share with us?
So one of the things that I tend to do online is that even if I'm sharing an opinion, I rarely actually type out a lot of opinions and share it, because if I have something to say, I'll draw it and I'll upload it, or I'll reshare that someone else is saying. But because by the time I've formed an opinion, there's already someone who has formed pretty much a similar, well nuanced opinion, and I'm like, okay, this works, and I'm happy to share that. But for me, what happens is that I like to take my time in sort of forming an opinion, and coming up with something to say rather than racing to say something, because I take it very seriously. I take what I say online very seriously. Everything from like talking about where I am physically on earth, and where I am, what I'm doing. I'm very careful about it, because I think I'm just very paranoid. But besides that, I feel like we have to take personal responsibility of how we share certain opinions and information. But one thing that I have noticed is that as an artist, it's a lot of pressure to perform immediately. That if you do not put something out there as a visual artist in response to something, you immediately start to feel like you're losing any like space to talk, and Instagram, for example, which is what I primarily use, does that deliberately, right? People will tell you you need to post every day, but you don't need to post every day because everyone is looking at your posts every day. You just need to post every day so that the algorithm doesn't bury you when you do post, right? So it's I don't know how you're supposed to build a practice, have clients, work, vacuum your house, read, and do all of that while creating so much work and keep churning it out on Instagram. And I've noticed like this whole influencer culture, or even creating a brand online type of culture, is not just something that is applied to artists. I see it being applied to journalists. Like a lot of platforms, mainstream media platforms that run online, I will not name them, have entire pay structures that if you are a journalist and you want to host, say, a story, say you want to report an on-ground story, they will pay you according to the number of followers you have, right? Which is like, now not only do you want journalists to have like hardcore information and contacts and work on their stories, but they should also have these many followers so that they can be paid for their labor, so I keep struggling between, on some days I wake up and I think, man, I really need more followers because my practice is completely independent, and on some days I want to be really like niche about it and say, oh, I have only so many followers, I will focus only on what I want to put out, so but at the same time I use my platform to, like Jyotsna said, right, I see it as a support to everything else, because I've been involved in protests, been involved in spaces on ground also, and all I want to do is support others, right, and help us sort of create a counterculture. So that's all that I see it as. I don't see, at the end of the day, we, no matter how much online activism we do, we are still dancing or responding to someone else's agenda, right? We aren't creating the agenda as of yet. So that is the problem for me, that we aren't on a platform where we get to set the agenda. Some Instagram reels, upper caste creator creates like a really casteist reel. Now all of us have to leave our work aside and spend the day calling this person out and get triggered, have 10 conversations with each other, trigger each other, not work, because now we spend the whole day calling this person out and wasted our time. At the end of the day, they will send a troll army to us and dox us or cancel us only. So it's like I don't know, as of now we're still responding to a lot of things, and I'm just dreaming that one of these days we get to set the agenda and hope that it can be a platform that works like that.
And with that, I'll ask Surya a question. I also know that he has to leave soon. Surya, so two things over here. Can we hold our platforms more accountable? And is that a question of legislation, investigative journalism, or is there something we can do as artists, as people who use the platform? That's one. Second is that, and related to this is that, I mean, we all know this, and I think especially with the markup, there's a lot of work that shows how this bias and this inequality carries on to online cultures. And it's so how do we imagine or reimagine platforms, or let's say the future of the internet, to work for us? Like how does one, is it possible? And does that mean creating new platforms? How do you kind of like use it as the old school internet was?
So again, very simple questions with very simple answers, but I think so I think of this in a couple of different ways. One of the ways is in which is what other people have brought up too, around how emphasizing how and this is where I think the literacy around technology becomes important, like emphasizing how technology enables old forms of impressions of oppression and like kind of power structures in new kind of clothing. So like a lot of the stuff that like is happening on tech platforms is like very old school. So like even this idea of like monopolistic powers and the way it works, it's very similar to how in the US AT&T was the monopoly telecomer, Rockefeller was the monopoly oil producer in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's patterns of like power and wealth that still, which have basically just been translated into the new economy. So like kind of highlighting to people that there's a lot of this talk about what makes the tech new, but being able to decouple what's new about the tech, but what's old about like, people with power trying to grab more power is, I think, one aspect that's important. But to the question around the alternatives, one of the big challenges I find is, as someone who also like really believes in the concept, having also done stuff like making my own networks and this kind of thing. The thing, unfortunately, that I hate to admit, but that is true in my experience, and I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong, but in my experience, what capitalism is very good at is bureaucracy and maintenance. Because what they actually do is they do a good job of paying people for their time to do bullshit stuff. And with all of these, like when I say bullshit stuff, I mean like kind of like day-to-day tasks that like, like that you can like decouple your personal passions and identity from the thing you do every day to keep this thing going. And the people who are working at platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all of these, the normal people who just have jobs and they're like kind of focusing on their life and they just go to work and do this thing. These companies have this ability to keep them doing that in a similar way to how like Unilever could do it around Union Carbide, or Coca-Cola does it, or any of these companies have always done it. And when we talk about the radical alternatives, it's always a labor of love, and it's a labor of intense work. And like just to literally maintain a server on the internet today in a way that is secure and not constantly, it's like, if you actually have like vulnerable information, and it's a full-time job. And that responsibility is, I think, what the real challenge is. And this whole idea of the internet being a freer space is also a little bit of like a myth, because it was a freer space when it was all a bunch of white dudes in California, right? It was a heterogeneous community. They already agreed on like a lot of the norms about how to behave on the internet, and it was just basically a playground for all of them. And they had all these radical, I mean, there's a really good essay that has aged very poorly, by this guy called John Perry Barlow, who used to be the head of one of the band members of the Grateful Dead, and also then started a privacy organization called the EFF. And it's called like Greetings from Cyberspace. And it's this whole like super like punchy take on like, oh, you old governments, I come from the future, I come from a land with no borders and no nations, this digital space where anyone can be free and whatever. And it was all true while it was a bunch of white dudes, right? In like one small town doing like, who kind of already agree with each other. What happens when you I think what we're dealing with now is like, everyone is being brought onto these platforms. These platforms have their own economies and policies that are in place. And then we're trying to navigate all of this stuff. And the thing that they have that, like, as much as I hate to admit it, that Google and Facebook have on us is they have really good engineering on which all of this relies. Like, I rely on Gmail. I rely on Google Drive. I rely on Instagram to get seen in a way that like wasn't even possible 15 years ago. And I think that tension is something we're still struggling with. And I don't think that the solution to that is technology. I think it's understanding the value of these tools, but decoupling it from the role the companies and the capitalist model plays. So for me, the imaginary that I would like to help build is like, how do you move forward to go away from the most like that? I think the model of technology and society right now is the most unimaginative. For all the things that it could have been, the things that we have now is the most basic kind of take on it, which is, this is how we used to make money. Let's try to reconstruct and remodel this thing to fit that model. And that's what we have. So I think like moving forward, that's what I'm excited about, is like, how do we change that conversation?
And make it more inclusive, I would say also. And maybe I think that also perhaps, is it fair to say in both your opinion and Kaushal's that means us being informed better, so we can ask different questions? And how do we do that? Like, any strategies on how we can inform ourselves better?
Honestly, for me, it's less about being informed better is important, but more than being informed better is more transparency. Like this whole idea around privacy, like it's all a trick of labor, right? Like the privacy conversation and the nothing to hide conversation, who doesn't get to be private in that? It's not the rich, right? The rich always buy their way out of being in the public sphere. Similarly, like the idea of like putting like my whole thing is, I don't want to put the onus on us as individuals to have to deal with this. There should be systems in place that acknowledge that these things can get fucked up, and we should be able to inquire about them in a meaningful way and hold people accountable for the actions of the policies, these platforms, or any technology put into place.
Do you have to go? In which case, I'll ask you one last question. or
I
otherwise
have 10 more minutes. So if you want to ask someone else, you can. And I can wait.
Okay, thanks. Kaushal, I was wondering, I think in a lot of your work that you do and also with Out of Line, there is a very interesting observation of the culture that is produced and which is related to the publics that is produced by these infrastructures. And I've often found that you find these points or notes where there's a glitch or a slip in where this, like you said, the smooth and globular understanding of how tech works and how the real life or like in physical infrastructures then puncture this imagination, or systemic inequalities puncture this imagination. Why is that position or that location, how is that productive for you? And what are some of the tools and tactics and strategies that you're already using or that you recommend that we kind of look through or work with?
I don't know if I have anything to recommend as such, but no, I thought that there's especially what Jyotsna and Srijana was saying earlier. I thought there was something that was really fascinating, which might connect to what you're asking now, Radha. No, one thing that I really caught on to was just when Srijana was talking about algorithms and the fact that like this question of who are you producing for, and then we think of these followers as such, but there's also seems to be some kind of awareness that there is something apart from followers that is looking at the stuff that is going up online. I had this fascinating experience where in 2019, in August 2019, there were protests that were happening in Hong Kong, and I was watching this video. It's quite an iconic video now, where the police enter the metro station and they start beating up people within the metro, and kind of indiscriminately. And the video of this incident was up online, and I was watching this incident with closed captions on, and when the sound from the video is basically of people screaming, of these cops beating up, and of the metro ambient sound. And the way the YouTube auto-generated algorithm tries to annotate it is through music and applause, right? So I mean, not to say that I mean, one reading could be that oh, this algorithm is stupid, kind of a thing, and in a way, sure, in this particular example, it did a misrecognition of sorts. But what is also, I feel, more fascinating is that even if nobody else is watching or listening, there is the algorithm that is kind of extracting something from it. Which is where something like even stuff like search engine optimization and writing for algorithms, kind of this whole discourse comes in. But the other thing that I was also fascinated by was this idea of speed or velocity, and this idea of what happens to taking your time to form an opinion, which I thought was something quite interesting to think through, because I felt like that taking your time to form an opinion is, or this what was being spoken about as a performance within performativity that platforms kind of push you to participate in. It takes away from that taking that time to internalize certain things or certain realities that we are surrounded by. And in that sense, I felt like I mean, one thing that I've been observing is just to find some kind of an elasticity within infrastructure. Like an example I can give is something like, if you really want to talk to somebody on a Zoom call, then it really doesn't matter if the internet is patchy. You power through it, kind of a thing, and you just, because at that moment, the important part is to continue the conversation or to enable the conversation. And as a say a tech company would try to approach it with technical solutions, but what we've been seeing throughout this conversation right now is basically just the incapacity of technical solutions, essentially. So I felt like when we are talking about a sense of community in this sort of realm, it often arises through testing some elasticity of infrastructures, and it's only at those limits when of that elasticity, that something gets revealed, which is to do with a sense of community. So it's kind of like not trying to conflate a WhatsApp group with a community, right? Or it's basically just the same thing about numbers. How do you translate numbers into a sense of a real sense of community? And that conflation is something that platforms are very good at, even in the language in which they articulate themselves. When they talk about your wall or your feed or your friends and your followers, and it's a very personalized situation that gets generated. But oftentimes I feel like it's only in those kind of some elastic limit of an infrastructure that you get to really test out what a sense of community really means. And I feel like this is not just something on digital platforms. This is something which which is which can be thought about infrastructure in general. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
It does. Thanks. One thing is that, guys, can you also look at the questions that have come? I think in specific, I think there's a question by Karen. Oh, and there's one, I'll just paste it. It was as a private message to me, which I think is for all of you. While we're doing that, Surya, I had a question for you. Actually, it's a question for everybody, and I don't even know if it's a question or a thought, but it would be good to get your like reflections on it. Is it possible that we don't have a correct enough vocabulary to explain all the feelings or all the cultures and human behavior that social media platforms, as we're using them now, are producing? And that might be a source of tension, because again, like if right to privacy is the only argument we can offer for most of the trolling and the shaming and the doxing that is happening, do we need, or the fact that it's, I mean, we're not even surprised anymore when BJP openly uses Instagram to censor and ban and delete complete like accounts and things like that. So do we need like more, I don't know, like new metaphors and imaginations to think about what this platform is? And for example, I was just from listening to what Shrujana and Jyotsna were saying. Also, I feel like, I mean, suddenly it's much easier to make someone feel shame on social media, and who do we hold accountable for that, and can it be made into a legislation? Or, I mean, is that a wrong question to ask, or is there a better question to ask?
I can take a shot at a bad answer, and hopefully someone can give a better one. But my opinion on that is, I have a very simple opinion on all of this stuff generally, which is that the real challenge, at least one of the fundamental challenges with all of this stuff, is the same thing that I feel like I've said a few times, which is the platform can change without any accountability to the public. These are public spaces that are run by private companies with a different set of values than, let's say, a park, or like or like something that's like built to the values of like a public body. So with all of this stuff, like there's a current form of doxing that's taking place, and like of harassment that's taking place. It has like a lot of its roots in what became successful through Gamergate, right? And like what Gamergate enabled was one of the first like examples of how that stuff happens. And I just think that for me, like one of the things I'm interested in is just seeing how to actually be able to persistently monitor these platforms. So as things evolve and things change, which is the difference between like social media and like traditional broadcast, like it just changes at a much slower pace. Being able to monitor those changes in a meaningful way and hold them accountable for these changes, I think would be a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's the full solution.
Quick follow-up question. Sorry. I guess my question was, and this is something someone had posted on Instagram yesterday, was that if Twitter decides that it wants to pack up business tomorrow, it can legally do that. But let's say the place Twitter has in across the world and the ways in which it is used, then do we need to like hold it to different kinds of legislations or standards? Or I mean, what is the accountability outside of being a business corporation, and is that important?
I would just add one more question to that, which is like, who are they accountable to, right? Like, I think we're seeing this as a real challenge with all of these platforms. Is like they transcend borders. Facebook's trying to make its own Supreme Court, to which it's like, this oversight board that they made, where they try to they're trying to make it up as they go along. And I think it's a real challenge in terms of like, how do nation states, global capitalism, the tech industry, what does it mean to be a global citizen right now in this way? And like, whose responsibility is it to hold these companies to account? I don't have an answer, but it's something I think a lot about too. And like every culture has its own context, and like the same rules just don't apply everywhere in the same way. Like, I mean, like even Mark Zuckerberg's whole take with why he created Facebook, which was to connect people and not accounting for the fact that some people shouldn't be connected to each other, and it's like unhealthy for them to be connected to each other, I think is like really revealing in how we are now living. So I don't have an answer, but I certainly think that like to do all of that, like the imagination around who we is needs to evolve, and like I hope that's where we're kind of moving with these conversations.
Radha, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Any thoughts, Kaushal and Shrujana? I'm sorry, Jyotsna had to leave.
One thing that I've worked as a UI designer for an app, and while working on that app, we would do a lot of research into humane design, because that's the in thing now. Even what we're talking about is appropriated by capitalism, and then they create their own structures over there also. So at the end of the day, it really depends on what kind of money we have. Like, honestly speaking, it all comes down to how we can actually create platforms that are safe or productive in that sense, or healthy. But this whole conversation that is happening now, like Netflix produces an entire documentary on how technology is so bad for you and social media is so bad for you, and that is a whole other lobby within big tech that is sort of sitting and countering each other and making humane design and inhumane design. So I mean, at this point, I can't help but feel like, irrespective of what we come up with, it's just going to be appropriated and used against us. I mean, that's what happened with the internet itself also, right? So I mean, if we could just solve the money problem.
I mean, there's one good example of that, right? I think Signal is a good example of like an app that has a different set of values, that is a non-profit, and is like really trying to live with these values, and they have money. And they have money because there are some rich people who believe in those people. But I completely agree with you. It does come down to money. And that's kind of what I was trying to make, the point I was making about like the bureaucracy of capitalism. They just pay people, so then they do the bullshit they need them to do in a way that's really hard when you can't pay them in the same way.
Yeah.
Radha, you are on mute.
Sorry, has it, Kaushal, any thoughts? Is blockchain the answer to everything, guys?
Oh God.
Sorry, that was a joke. That was a joke.
No, I mean, I don't know. I feel with regulation or with conversations around regulation, I feel slightly alienated. I don't know whether it's just me or, and maybe it is that I'm kind of nostalgic for something that I was too young to experience or something like that. But I mean, it is true that, I mean, what I'm trying to constantly think through is not so much through regulation, but through what came earlier in terms of sense of community. Um, because I feel like the conversations around regulation are where you engage with bureaucracy or you engage with state apparatus or in terms of making and changing laws. I mean, we are seeing this play out in terms of other laws in India, right? And in many senses, those conversations often become I mean, they often kind of sideline the work that one does to produce a sense of community. And I feel like I was just kind of reading through some of the comments that or the questions that are coming in the chat, and I mean, I'm trying to kind of riff off of some of them and kind of between the chat and here, but I do feel like uh, I mean, with regulation, you're again kind of talking in terms of, or you're talking a bureaucratic language, or you're talking in a bureaucratic language within this sphere. And like I said, I feel like it kind of the other part of it, which is the very impetus to communicate to each other. I'm sorry about the train sounds, but that's how my life is. Uh, but the real motive or the impetus is to communicate, and I feel like for me, at least, the way I'm trying to approach with this thing approach the internet is to try and think about what does it mean to communicate and what does it mean to mediate that communication, because once you start mediating this communication, you encounter these protocols, and these protocols that have been made with, like we earlier discussed, a very kind of benevolent technologist mindset. But like, for example, with Inqilab Network, one thing really came up when we started working on a chat room, which was a question of moderation. And as soon as something like this happens, I feel like it really, there are certain answers that come quite quite fast to you and they feel quite inclusive, but they're not, they really are not. I mean, another example that I can give is that in the past couple of years, in the art world, there is a certain co-opting of the internet as a way to accelerate the industry in a sense, but again in a very asymmetrical manner. So I've been really curious about something like the phenomenon of web residencies. Uh, and it was a fascinating experience for me, because I was supposed to go to a residency and then it became a web residency, and I realized that I was spending that month trying to deal with like COVID crisis and parallelly do a web residency, where I'm supposed to give some time and labor to produce a sense of community, which is what residencies do, or which is what you enjoy about residencies. And so I feel like, does then the web residency really become or does it become like does it really do what it starts out to do, or does it become just like a marker of something that has gotten done? So in that sense, I feel some kind of a fundamental rethinking of just forms of coming together that we take for granted needs to happen, away from the pre-existing forms that the platforms are already providing us with. And not to say that I'm not at all advocating any kind of an allergy to platforms. And I'm not at all saying that everyone should start their own server and just completely kind of boycott platforms at all. That's not the argument at all. In fact, I feel it's the other way around. It's participation, but it's participation with a sense of awareness of the ulterior motive of the platform, and of a certain tactical mode in which you can engage to foster the whole reason why you're doing this, right? To communicate. Yeah, I think I've gone all around the place, but
Thanks. I think the last question of the evening is what Karen asked Surya. Surya, if you can take it. I think it's there in the chat for everyone to read.
I'm just scrolling back up. Okay, so I would like to understand more about the argument. I have nothing to add, so I can able to refuse. Yeah, so the question I think here is, why couldn't a valid response to things like Pegasus be for us to have a mass movement to refuse to be secretive, and for us to make everything public and make their lists of people too large to handle, and at the same time to attack the laws that try to make us scared and illegal? So that's a really good question. And I think it gets to the heart of the problem with a lot of this stuff, which is that it doesn't work in like a normal way. It works when you want to target someone. So the idea that people won't have, that you can live in a completely public way often works for people who fit society the most comfortably. And like the people, and there are a lot of people who need privacy for their own safety and their own kind of like ability to just exist. So so the idea that like you can have like this radical transparency without any privacy, I think feeds into a case of like normalizing everyone into one kind of model, and it leads to, I basically think it can be dangerous. I think the idea that like, I think we should have privacy as a value that we keep, and like privacy, I think also, I should just be clear, I think is different in different contexts. Like, you know, growing up in Delhi, like I had no notion of privacy around my room, for example. I never like locked my room. And if I locked my room, I think my family would be like, he's doing drugs or doing something suspicious. But I met people here in the US for whom like there was an expectation that they would, you know, have their personal space and it could be protected. So I think it means different things to different people. And we've actually, this idea of like the Pegasus attack is a really good example. Like there's a really telling story of this kind of mass surveillance and the way it doesn't work that actually came out of the Snowden leaks related to the Mumbai attacks, which was that in 2010, the FBI picked up a guy in Norway related to some attacks that were going to happen there. This guy, Daniel something, I forget his last name now. And he was basically one of the masterminds that perpetuated the 2008 attacks in Mumbai. And he got caught for something else and basically said, hey, if you let me go or like give me like a reduced sentence, I'll tell you everything you want to know about how that attack came to be. And when he did, the NSA went back and saw that they actually had all this information collected in their dragnet. But because of the signal to noise ratio and how hard it is to find any information out, they didn't surface it. So actually, like the point Karen's making, I think is completely on point. It's like, it doesn't actually work. The idea that they can tell about an individual doesn't work. It only works when they've already decided which individual to target. Right? So like, and that's what Pegasus is showing us. It's not that it just works for everyone. They're like, these people are in our way and we want to target them. And who has access to those tools is what's fundamentally problematic. And that's why I think like stuff like Signal and the ways in which they're trying to at least solve some parts of those problems through math and software, like not all of it, but at least a part of it, are important. So so for me, like all of that to say, and so I think this is the last thing I'll just say about all of this is just that I think you need all the things. I think you need regulation. I think you need literacy. I think you need radical imagination. I think you need other ways of building platforms. So like one of the things that I wish existed, like a really simple law that could take a lot of power away from these platforms, is interoperability. So the ability to download your data in an open format standard so that someone can make an alternative platform into which you can import it. So we don't have one Facebook, but 1,000 Facebooks. There's no technical reason why that can't exist right now. There's a lot of like simple things that could be done. Abolishing copyright, like just getting rid of the idea of copyright completely would actually be, because copyright like, is just like the way it exists right now is just actually a completely predatory mechanism that allows big companies to kind of assert their power in a place that they shouldn't have a right to. So there are things I think that can happen that currently can only be done through regulation, mostly because if you try to do them through an art context or a other context, the people don't take you seriously. So I think you need all the things. And I think you need the art to like to fire up the imagination. I think that can help translate what people who are working in the more mainstream space can change the conversation and the culture around this stuff so that we can talk about it in a more like holistic way. Like what I wish for the world in this space is that you can smell when technology tastes funky. You know, like when it's like something smells rotten, like we should be able to build an intuition for these guys, like this page is loading. Like, you know, I have an intuition now for when a piece of tech is gross, because it's loading a little slowly. Why is that loading slowly? Probably because they have a bunch of trackers loaded. You know, there's like this kind of smell test that I think regulation can help guide. I really don't think it's the final answer, but I think it's that first step into forcing them. And like the thing that I find always so crazy is that we are more confident putting our bodies into these aluminum cans and go 30,000 feet above the air, and that is totally safe and possible, but we are unable to communicate with each other in a way that feels safe and possible, because that somehow is more complicated than building a plane or building pharmaceutical drugs that, like, you know, we all ingest with complete confidence. So some parts of these, I think, are things that can be like, I think you just need all the stuff, right? All the stuff to challenge these narratives, and you need the regulation, the imagination, the competition, all of it. That is my final rant, and now I'll shut up.
Thank you so much. Any closing remarks by the Culture Workers Trust? Otherwise, I would like to thank all of you for a super amazing conversation.
Well, thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful, insightful conversation and discussion.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Vidyun has been managing the whole backroom process of keeping the conversation going. So Vidyun, would you like to give a vote of thanks to all the participants?
Yeah, I just would.
Have you lost her again?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, my internet connection today has been terrible because of the rain in Delhi. But would just like to thank all of the panelists and especially those whose presentations have been affected on account of my bad internet. But thank you for joining. It's really interesting discussion. To think about. Thank you, Radha, for taking the time asking such questions. And lastly, of course, Zubaan for helping us with this Zoom link for the meeting and all the technical support. Thank you, Shani. And I think that's it from us today. And we hope to see you next time.
Thanks all of you, and
Thank you.
all of you, and especially also Radha for, like, I think the way she put together questions have really made a lot of interesting conversations come out. So thank you so much, Radha, for that. And I was just as an ending, as something was going on in my mind, I thought maybe I just a small reflection, thinking about all this conversation that we are having, and internet and social media responsibilities, and also this thing about keep on reaching out to people. And simultaneously, there are some other things which all of us are seeing, which are happening, which are about bringing some very physical old model into the play, actually real play. And two examples which were coming in my mind were, one is a radio, which is becoming like, which became really more and more and more very in different ways popular. And one is a very physical radio, made it look like a radio, is a Saregama, that Caravan thing that which look like a old kind of system that one associate with, but it is a digital device. It has in like, it has things input inside it. One can also insert pen drive in it. But the thing about actually going back to that, and it is selling in numbers, like people really want to buy it and buy them. So that was coming in my mind, just thinking about all this. And the other, thinking again about radio in an extremely effective way, of course, Man Ki Baat and Modi, and totally taking a different route from all this social media in that sense, and taking one more, not another route, but one more route, and with his that slow pace speeches that reaches where he want to reach out. that was just coming in my mind in thinking about all this as yeah, I just thought I'll share with you. Yeah.
So with those last remarks from Vidyun and Lokesh, I'd like to thank you all once again, and we hope you'll join us for our next conversation, which will take place on the 30th of September. Please note that down in your calendars. We've got 2 speakers lined up for the next session already, and we're waiting for one more person to respond, but we hope to have an equally scintillating session next time. So thank you very much for coming on board, and see you again.